A 920-page document sits on servers across America right now. Most Christians have never read it. Most Americans don't even know it exists. But if the people who wrote it get their way, it will reshape every aspect of American life, from what your children learn in school to whether you can access birth control, from how the government operates to what it means to be an American citizen. This document is called Project 2025, and it's not a conspiracy theory or a leaked secret plan. It's published openly by the Heritage Foundation, one of America's most influential conservative think tanks. It's detailed, comprehensive, and designed to be implemented on day one of the next conservative presidency. And here's what most people don't understand. Project 2025 isn't just a policy agenda. It's a Christian nationalist blueprint for fundamentally transforming America into what its authors believe is a Christian nation. They want to reshape the federal government, redefine religious freedom, restrict personal freedoms, and merge Christian conservative values with state power. If you want to understand one of the most consequential political documents of our time, subscribe now. We're building a community that goes beyond headlines to examine the deep history and truth behind faith, politics, and power. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Because what I'm about to show you will change how you see the intersection of faith, politics, and power in America. This isn't about left versus right. This is about whether American Christianity is being used to justify authoritarian governance. Let me start with the basics because most people have heard the name but don't actually know what Project 2025 is. In 2022, the Heritage Foundation, along with over 100 conservative organizations, began developing what they call the Presidential Transition Project, commonly known as Project 2025. It's a comprehensive plan for the next conservative president to implement a radical transformation of the federal government within the first 180 days in office. The document is divided into 4 main pillars: a policy guide called Mandate for Leadership with detailed recommendations for every federal agency, a personnel database of thousands of pre-vetted conservative loyalists ready to be appointed to government positions, a training program called the Presidential Administration Academy to prepare these individuals, and a 180-day playbook of executive orders and actions to be taken immediately upon assuming office. This isn't normal transition planning. Every incoming administration prepares for transition, but Project 2025 is unprecedented in its scope, detail, and ideological coherence. It's not just about changing policies, it's about fundamentally restructuring how the federal government operates and what values it serves. The Mandate for Leadership portion alone is 920 pages of specific policy recommendations covering every cabinet department and federal agency. It tells the next conservative president exactly what to do with the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, the EPA, the FDA, HHS, the military, and every other part of the federal bureaucracy. And woven throughout this document, often explicitly and sometimes implicitly, is a Christian nationalist worldview that sees America as a Christian nation that has strayed from its godly foundations and must be reclaimed through political power. The authors claim they're simply returning America to its founding principles, but what they're actually proposing is a dramatic expansion of executive power, a restriction of individual rights, and the imposition of conservative Christian values through government authority. If you're starting to see why this matters, subscribe now and join thousands exploring the intersection of faith, history, and modern politics, because we need to dig into what this document actually says. Let me show you the theological and ideological foundation underlying Project 2025, because you can't understand the policy recommendations without understanding the worldview driving them. The document is built on several key assumptions that reflect Christian nationalist thinking. First, America is fundamentally a Christian nation founded on biblical principles, and the separation of church and state is a modern myth that betrays the founders' intent. Second, American decline over the past several decades is directly attributable to the abandonment of Christian values, particularly regarding sexuality, gender, family structure, and religious authority in public life. Third, reversing this decline requires not just winning elections but using government power to reshape society according to conservative Christian values. Fourth, religious freedom primarily means protecting conservative Christian practices and beliefs, not genuine pluralism or equal protection for all faiths. And fifth, compromise with progressive values is not just politically unwise but morally wrong. This is a spiritual battle, not just a political disagreement. These assumptions appear repeatedly throughout the document, sometimes explicitly stated and sometimes embedded in policy language. For example, the section on the Department of Health and Human Services doesn't just propose ending federal funding for abortion. It describes abortion as a tool of the radical left and frames opposition to abortion as defending the sanctity of life in explicitly Christian theological terms. The section on education repeatedly refers to parents' rights to direct their children's education, but what it actually means is the right of conservative Christian parents to shield their children from ideas the authors consider ungodly, particularly regarding sexuality, gender identity, evolution, and American history. The section on the Department of Justice calls for protecting religious freedom, but the examples given are exclusively about protecting conservative Christians from anti-discrimination laws that conflict with their beliefs about homosexuality and gender. Throughout the document, there's an assumption that Christian conservative values should be the default position of American government, and that any deviation from this represents anti-Christian bias. This isn't policy neutrality. It's the imposition of a particular religious worldview through state power. And here's what makes this Christian nationalism rather than just Christian political engagement. The authors consistently conflate American national identity with conservative Christian identity, suggesting that to be truly American is to embrace their particular vision of Christianity, and that those who don't share this vision are threats to American civilization. Let me walk you through some of the most significant policy recommendations in Project 2025, organized by theme so you can see exactly what implementation would look like. On abortion and reproductive rights, Project 2025 calls for the Department of Justice to enforce the Comstock Act, a dormant 19th century law that could effectively ban abortion nationwide by prohibiting the mailing of abortion pills and medical equipment. It recommends the FDA reverse approval of mifepristone, the most common abortion medication. It proposes eliminating all federal funding for Planned Parenthood and any organization that provides or refers for abortions. It calls for the Department of Health and Human Services to declare that life begins at conception and to redefine federal programs accordingly. It recommends that the CDC stop collecting abortion data to make it harder to track abortion access. And it proposes that federal employees' health insurance should not cover abortion under any circumstances. These aren't just restrictions on abortion. They're a coordinated plan to use every lever of federal power to make abortion inaccessible nationwide. On LGBTQ rights and gender identity, Project 2025 calls for eliminating all federal recognition of gender identity, defining sex strictly as binary and biological. It recommends removing all protections for transgender individuals from federal civil rights enforcement. It proposes prohibiting the military from covering transition-related medical care and discharging service members who are transgender. It calls for defunding any schools that teach about gender identity or allow transgender students to use facilities matching their gender identity. It recommends eliminating federal programs that support LGBTQ youth. And it proposes that religious organizations should have the right to discriminate against LGBTQ individuals in employment, housing, and services, even when receiving federal funding. The justification given throughout these recommendations is religious freedom and parental rights, but the effect is to use federal power to marginalize and discriminate against LGBTQ Americans. On education, Project 2025 doesn't just call for reforming the Department of Education, it calls for eliminating it entirely. It proposes ending all federal education programs and returning education entirely to states, which would defund public schools in low-income areas that depend on federal support. It recommends promoting universal school choice, which sounds neutral but effectively means diverting public education funding to private religious schools. It calls for prohibiting schools from teaching critical race theory, gender ideology, or any curriculum that doesn't align with conservative values. It proposes eliminating federal protections for LGBTQ students. And it recommends that the federal government should actively promote classical Christian education as the model for American schooling. On religious freedom, Project 2025 redefines what this means in practice. It calls for a federal law protecting religious organizations from having to comply with anti-discrimination laws when those laws conflict with their religious beliefs. It proposes that religious employers, including those receiving federal contracts and funding, should be able to discriminate in hiring based on religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity. It recommends eliminating the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits churches from endorsing political candidates while maintaining tax-exempt status. It calls for federal agencies to accommodate religious objections to virtually any law or regulation, including healthcare requirements, employment laws, and public accommodation laws. And it proposes that religious conscience protections should extend not just to religious organizations but to any individual or business owner who claims religious objections. What this means in practice is that religious freedom is redefined from equal protection for all faiths to privileged status for conservative Christianity. On immigration, Project 2025 takes an explicitly nationalist approach, calling for mass deportations, ending birthright citizenship for children of undocumented immigrants, eliminating most refugee admissions, and prioritizing immigrants from Christian-majority countries. The document frames immigration not just as a security issue but as a cultural and religious threat to American identity. Let me be specific about why Project 2025 represents Christian nationalism and not just Christian political engagement, because this distinction matters. Christian political engagement means Christians participating in democracy, advocating for their values, voting their conscience, and working for policies they believe serve the common good. That's legitimate. That's healthy. That's how democracy works. Christian nationalism is something different. It's the belief that American national identity and Christian identity are inseparable, that America is a Christian nation by definition, and that government should enforce Christian values and privilege Christian practices. Project 2025 crosses this line repeatedly and systematically. First, it conflates American identity with conservative Christian identity throughout the document. It consistently frames policy debates not as disagreements among Americans with different values, but as battles between true Americans defending Christian civilization and anti-American forces threatening to destroy it. The section on civics education, for example, calls for teaching that America is fundamentally a Christian nation and that the founders intended biblical principles to guide government. This isn't just inaccurate historically. Many founders were deists, the Constitution never mentions God or Christianity, and the Treaty of Tripoli explicitly states that America is not a Christian nation. It's an attempt to write Christian nationalism into official government curricula. Second, Project 2025 treats religious freedom as primarily about protecting conservative Christianity rather than equal protection for all faiths. When the document discusses religious freedom, it provides example after example of conservative Christians being protected from anti-discrimination laws, being allowed to discriminate against LGBTQ individuals, being exempted from healthcare requirements they object to, and being given privileged access to government funding and public spaces. But when it comes to Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, or non-religious Americans, the document is either silent or actively hostile. The immigration section, for instance, proposes prioritizing Christian immigrants and restricting Muslim immigration. The education section proposes promoting Christian classical education as the model for American schools, but says nothing about accommodating Muslim, Jewish, or Hindu students. Third, Project 2025 uses the government to impose conservative Christian sexual ethics on all Americans. The sections on abortion, contraception, LGBTQ rights, marriage, and family structure don't just propose that conservative Christians should be free to live according to their beliefs. They propose using federal law, regulation, and enforcement to make everyone live according to those beliefs. Fourth, Project 2025 rejects pluralism as a governing principle. Throughout the document, there's an assumption that there's one correct set of values, conservative Christian values, and that all other value systems are either wrong or illegitimate. The document doesn't propose how a diverse society can navigate moral disagreements. It proposes how conservative Christians can use political power to impose their values on everyone else. And fifth, Project 2025 centralizes power in the executive branch in ways that should concern anyone who cares about constitutional limits on government. The document proposes that the president should have direct control over what are currently independent agencies, that thousands of civil servants should be fired and replaced with political loyalists, and that executive orders should be used to implement sweeping changes without congressional approval. Let me address this from a biblical perspective, because the authors of Project 2025 claim biblical authority for their vision, and many Christians are being told that supporting this agenda is faithfulness to God. So let's look at what Scripture actually says. First, on the relationship between faith and government, Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's." He was establishing two distinct spheres of authority. Christians owe civic obligations to government, but government doesn't get the ultimate allegiance that belongs only to God. When Peter and the apostles were ordered by governing authorities to stop preaching, they said we must obey God rather than human beings. The early church understood that there are limits to political authority, that Christians must sometimes disobey government when it commands what God forbids, and that no earthly kingdom represents the kingdom of God. Second, on religious freedom and pluralism, Jesus consistently showed respect and compassion to those outside his religious community. He healed Roman soldiers, spoke with Samaritan women, ate with tax collectors and sinners, and told stories where Samaritans and Gentiles demonstrated greater faithfulness than religious insiders. He commanded his followers to love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, and do good to those who hate you. Paul wrote that if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. These teachings call Christians to engage those who disagree with them with love and respect, not to use political power to marginalize them. Third, on how Christians should engage politically, the New Testament emphasizes witness over power. Jesus told Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world, and if it were, my servants would fight." He rejected the path of political revolution and military power. The early church grew not by gaining political power and imposing Christian values through law, but by forming communities of radical love, generosity, and sacrifice that were so compelling that people wanted to join them. Paul wrote that our weapons are not the weapons of the world. We don't use manipulation, coercion, or force to advance God's kingdom. Fourth, on the use of power, Jesus said, "Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. The last will be first, and the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, but it will not be so among you." He modeled a way of power that serves, sacrifices, and suffers rather than dominates and controls. When Christians use political power to impose their values, restrict others' freedoms, and marginalize vulnerable populations, they're using power in the way of Rome, not the way of Jesus. Let me close by explaining why Project 2025 should concern every American. For Christians, it represents a dangerous confusion of Christianity with political power. When the church allies itself closely with government authority, history shows that both suffer. The church loses its prophetic voice, its ability to critique power, and its witness to a kingdom that transcends politics. Christianity itself becomes identified with political ideology rather than with Jesus. Young people already see Christianity as more about political positions than following Christ, and implementing Project 2025 would accelerate this perception. For LGBTQ Americans, Project 2025 would mean the federal government actively working to marginalize, discriminate against, and erase you from public life. For women, it would mean losing reproductive autonomy and being forced to carry unwanted pregnancies. For religious minorities, it would mean living in a country that privileges Christianity over your faith. For anyone who cares about constitutional governance and limited government, Project 2025 represents a massive expansion of executive power and the elimination of checks and balances. And for American democracy itself, it represents the triumph of Christian nationalism over pluralistic democracy. So here's my final question for you. Is this the Christianity you recognize? Is this what Jesus meant when he said, "Go and make disciples"? Is political domination the way of the cross? The authors of Project 2025 genuinely believe they're defending Christianity and saving America. But what they're actually proposing is to use government power to impose religious values, restrict freedoms, marginalize minorities, and centralize authority. That's not Christianity. That's Christian nationalism. And there's a difference. If this investigation challenged you, convicted you, or gave you clarity, subscribe to the Christian Faith Archive right now. We're building a community that examines faith, history, and power with honesty and depth. Click that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and share this with Christians who need to understand what's being done in their name, with Americans who need to know what's being proposed, and with anyone who cares about the future of religious freedom and democracy. In the comments, tell me, should Christians support Project 2025? Is this faithfulness or distortion? Where's the line between Christian political engagement and Christian nationalism? Until then, remember, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." The question is whether American Christians will believe him or keep trying to build his kingdom through political power. America has survived wars, depressions, and divisions, but the real test is whether faith will stay humble or become a weapon. The choice will define the next generation.